Let Mysteries at Midnight be your destination for detective whodunits and captivating mystery stories. You'll hear classic stories like Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie's Poirot, and short tales from H.G. Wells, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and others. I'm Christopher, and I read these classic stories in the soothing style of a bedtime story, so you can listen to them in bed when you drift off to sleep. Search for Mysteries at Midnight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favourite podcast app, and follow and subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes.
Yeah, Film Vault.
We are one of the original film podcasts.
That can't be true.
There was like 2 other film podcasts when we began, Brian.
How long have we doing this show?
You and I first sat down and did a version of the show over 20 years ago.
My God.
2 episodes each week. One,
we review movies, and the first episode, and the second one, different top 5 every week. Movies that made you cry. Worst movie accents. Most disturbing movies. All right, the Film Vault. Check it out.
Wherever you find podcasts.
That's right. The Film Vault, going on 20 plus years.
Behind the doors of an isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a trove of macabre secrets was stashed out of sight of the locals that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Unearthed in 1957, the world of the quiet, shy farmer Edward Theodore Gein revealed a bizarre story of grave robbing, body parts fashioned into household items, and a fascination with death that was almost unparalleled in its depravity. A psychiatrist's examination stated plainly that the overall picture was not that of a well person, which was, perhaps, one of the greatest understatements in medical and criminal history. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 14. I'm your host, Ben. As always, I hope you're well. Today, I have a little bit of news, not really news. There was a bit of an issue, I think, with the RSS feed. So I think the distribution was a little bit whack over the last episode or so. I didn't actually realise until a few days ago. So it should be fixed now, I think. But if there was any if you didn't get the episode or you got the episode quite late, I think that was down to that, but it should be fixed now. I think I fixed it. I also think it perhaps only affected people who listen on Apple Podcasts, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Anyway, it should be fixed now. And if you're hearing this, then hooray, it is fixed. So nothing to worry about. I just wanted to basically just give you a heads up as to why that happened. And in fact, I don't know why it happened. It's some sort of issue with the RSS feed, but it should be fixed now. So fingers crossed you're hearing this and everything is good. Yes, so there's that. On to this week's episode. I want to give you another quick heads up. This episode has some pretty graphic gore, I guess. Not a lot. It's only a couple of paragraphs, but there is a couple of paragraphs that get quite heavy. So I just wanted to give you a quick heads up. Normally I don't do sort of warnings before Dark Histories. I mean, the podcast's called Dark Histories. I think, it feels a bit patronising almost, but and there's also the fact that probably every episode has something that could potentially trigger someone. We're all individuals and we all have our individual quirks. But for me, I personally found this episode quite difficult. So just a bit of a heads up. It's perhaps not for everyone, this episode, but on the other hand, perhaps it is. So who knows? Just wanted to give you a little warning just in case. So it's only a couple of paragraphs where it gets fairly gory, but you'll see them come in anyway. So yeah, anyway, thanks for listening. This episode is called A Boy's Best Friend is His Mother, The Horrors of Ed Gein. Almost slap bang in the centre of the state of Wisconsin, America, the town of Plainfield in Waushara County, with its population floating around 800, is a pretty small little island in the vast swathes of Midwestern countryside that surround it on all sides. First settled in 1848 by a pioneering entrepreneur from New York State, the first general store opened 7 years later, with the railways arriving in 1875, giving the town a small boost and seeing it leap from a handful of businesses to well over 60. Despite this growth, it was never an easy place to live, and an element of the pioneering spirit that saw the town founded was needed by settlers there for decades after it became established. The farms were large, sparsely situated, and unsurprisingly, thanks to their cheap purchase prices, they were frequently barren. Unlike the south of the state, the further north you travel, the more the agriculture gives way to empty vistas and dense forest. Many of the farms that popped up throughout Washira County in the latter half of the 19th century had either large wooded areas that boxed in their fields or open ground littered with stumps thanks to deforestation. Having initially found some prosperity through growing wheat for several decades, many farms throughout this side of the state switched to livestock and dairy farming, as the ground and climate never seemed to ease up on the struggling farmers, who were finding themselves barely scratching out a living. Others turned to potatoes, but they were never an especially lucrative crop for the area. All told, it was a lonely, bleak and unforgiving part of the state, one that saw the bustling prosperity of the south quickly degrade into rural solitude, with frighteningly small towns broken up by thousands and thousands of acres of desolate land. The occasional farmhouse might have been scattered about, watching over the empty landscape like a dilapidated sentry tower. One journalist, writing on Washira County in the mid-20th century, described it as having a peculiar, lonely, wild feeling, a feeling of people struggling just for subsistence, a feeling that an honest living is hard to come by in this throbbingly poor area. Western Washira County has some farms, but almost all show no signs of prosperity. Almost all look run down, and as the line is crossed into Adams County, the wilderness takes over into desolation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in such a sparsely populated and challenging environment to live, the community was especially strong. Everyone knew everyone in Plainfield. Neighbours looked out for one another, and people struggled, celebrated and mourned together. When anything out of the ordinary happened, fingers were often quickly pointed, and justice was quickly measured out, which was a relief to many of the residents, as the alternative meant something much more frightening. The alternative meant that someone in the community was perhaps not quite who they thought they were. Unfortunately, by the 1950s, this exact scenario seemed to be growing far too common, and the bleak atmosphere that surrounded the town of Plainfield began encroaching more and more upon the small town. In 1952, 2 hunters visiting Plainfield to hunt deer as part of the annual hunting season disappeared without trace. There was only a few scraps of bloody clothing that was ever found. A year later, a 15-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley, whilst out babysitting a neighbour's 20-month-old child, was abducted, and despite a search party of more than 1,000 locals, nothing was ever found of her body except the bloody shoes that she'd left behind as she'd been dragged from a rear window out into the surrounding woodland. On Wednesday, the 8th of December 1954, Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner, was abducted from her bar in Bancroft, 10 miles north of Plainfield. One of the locals, Seymour Lester, had sauntered into the tavern for a drink when he found the whole place empty, a smeared bloodstain streaking across the floor to the exit, and a spent .32 caliber shell lying on the ground. Running from the bar, Lester made a beeline for the nearest farmhouse, where he called the sheriff. The crime lab was enlisted, but no leads were ever discovered, and the case quickly fell cold. And then, 3 years later, on the opening weekend of the annual deer season, Plainfield saw a murder fall right on their doorstep. Warden's hardware store was a well-known feature of the east end of town. The proprietor was a 58-year-old widow named Bernice Warden, who had continued running the store after her husband's death in 1931. Like most in the area, the outdoors was ingrained in her life, and aside from being an astute business owner, she was a keen hunter and fisher. Her son, Frank Warden, who happened to be the recently appointed deputy sheriff, also worked as an assistant in the store, and together the two kept the local farmers and townsfolk stocked with antifreeze, tools, firearms, paint, seeds, and all manner of potentially life-saving odds and ends in what was essentially in a survivalist landscape. That weekend, Frank had joined the vast majority of the townsmen in the deer hunt, leaving Bernice in the store alone, though thanks to the hunt she was not expecting much in the way of custom. It was sometime between 8:45 and 9:30 a.m. when Bernard Mashinsky, the owner of the gas station opposite Warden's, saw the Warden pickup truck leaving from the rear of the shop. That in itself was not especially unusual, but he called it to mind later that day when he nipped over to the store only to find the door locked and the shop floor apparently empty. Shrugging it off, he assumed that Bernice had closed up shop early due to the hunt, but it was a bit queer that she'd left the light on. It was 5 p.m. when Frank Warden returned from the hunt. He'd stopped over at Bernard's gas station on the way home, and Bernard mentioned seeing the van leave and the store being empty. Slightly concerned about this, knowing that his mother had intended to stay open all day, he crossed the road for himself and peered in through the window. Just like Bernard had described, the shop was empty, but the light was still glowing away into the dimly lit street. Driving home, he picked up his store key and then quickly returned, swinging open the door and calling out into the quiet. He'd barely set foot in the store before he knew that something wasn't quite right. The cash register, usually perched on the front desk, was missing for a start, and as he looked deeper into the store, he saw dark red stains smeared across the floor, leading out to the back door that looked unmistakably like blood. Following the macabre trail, he pushed the back door open and saw the empty parking bay where the store truck should have been. Stumbling back into the store, Frank telephoned Sheriff Art Sly, who in turn got in touch with Arnie Fritz, the chief deputy, and the two men made their way down to Warden's store. As soon as they arrived, they found Frank looking stunned. Frank greeted them darkly before blurting out, "He's done something to her." The sheriff calmed him down for a moment and then asked Frank who he was talking about. Frank replied without hesitation, "Ed Gein." Born on the 27th of August 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was the second child of George and Augusta Gein, two of Plainfield's more hard-up farmers. George had been orphaned at the age of 3 after his father, mother and sister were caught in a flash flood, drowning them all in their wagon as it headed into town. George, who had been left at home for the trip, was handed over to his grandparents, a pair of hard Scottish immigrants who had lived a strict Lutheran lifestyle on a farm in the west of Wisconsin. George attended school and then took on an apprenticeship as a blacksmith before moving to La Crosse City, where he bumped about, drifting between jobs, selling insurance, working the railways, and practicing as a tanner and carpenter. Despite only being 24 years old, George had already taken to drinking heavily, a hobby which did not help him hold down a job for any period of time. Whilst he worked at the tannery, he met a colleague's cousin, a 19-year-old girl named Augusta, who, just like him, had grown up in a severely religious family. A fellow Lutheran, her father had taught her from a young age that the world was a dirty, sinful place, and he'd not been shy of using his belt to ensure that she didn't contribute to this ungodly outside world. Unlike George, Augusta came from a large family with 6 siblings, something which may well have helped entice George to her from the outset, and before long, the two were married on the 4th of December 1899. The marriage quickly turned sour when the extent of George's drinking became apparent. Not that Augusta was especially troubled by it, she was more than happy to crack down on her useless husband should she need to, and she frequently beat George for the unholy sin of alcoholism. Before long, the couple could barely tolerate one another, and most conversations were carried out via arguments that, more often than not, turned violent from one side or the other. Despite all of this, though, the couple did somehow manage to have a child, born 3 years after their marriage, which they named Henry. Augusta was somewhat disappointed, as she'd always wanted a girl, but she didn't really have the time to complain. She had the family grocery store to run, which she had bought with George shortly after the birth of their child. It was more or less a family business for Augusta, who had 2 brothers running similar businesses already, and so, with the drunken husband who had taken to retreating more and more into himself, Augusta cracked on with the issues of raising a child and running a busy store, dealing with stock, butchering animals for meat, and dealing with the local customers, all of whom were well aware as to who wore the trousers down at the Gein Meat and Groceries. The ache of wanting to raise a daughter, though, never really left Augusta, and so 4 years later, the hateful couple somehow managed to tolerate one another enough to once again produce a child. Unfortunately for Augusta, it was just another boy, which they named Edward Theodore. As one might imagine, Ed's upbringing was especially harsh. Just like Augusta and George before, Ed grew up under the watchful eye of his devoutly religious mother, who by now was running the household like a true governor. Meanwhile, George failed to inflict any strong impression of himself onto his sons whatsoever, as he continued to shrink away from his family duties. Ed quickly learned of the ungodly sickness of the outside world. His mother read scripture to him routinely, and images like those of Babylon the Great were burned deep into his mind, as were the messages that Augusta chose to present. Growing up in the store, Ed's playground was made between the aisles of tinned foods and snacks, and one of his earliest memories was that of sneaking a peek into the back room, where he saw his mother gutting a pig hanging from a butcher's hook. This was all just part of her daily routine. In 1913, when Ed was aged 7, the Gein family moved away from La Crosse. Augusta had been saving the profits from the grocery store, and finally she'd made enough for the family to move out of the sinful, disgusting city and into the rural wilderness, where she could snap up a good-sized farm away from all the filth and make an honest living. Moving 40 miles east, Augusta purchased a small dairy farm. But something apparently failed to click there, and so a year later she sold it and moved the whole family once more, this time purchasing a much larger 194-acre farm 6 miles from the outskirts of Plainfield. Here was much more conducive to Augusta's religious ideal. The town itself might have been full of sinners, she thought, but at least their nearest neighbours were a quarter of a mile away. The farm was a good size too. Along with a 2-storey large wooden farmhouse, the acreage came with a barn, a chicken coop and good-sized shed. The only major issue was the lack of Lutheran church in the area, but that didn't concern Augusta too much. She was more than happy to continue with her son's religious tuition herself. Ed did manage to get off of the farm for his regular education, however, and he attended school in Plainfield from the age of 8 until 1922, when he turned 16. He'd always been known as a decent enough student, if a little odd. He cried a lot at school. Most figured he wasn't especially good at taking a joke, but he never really liked their rowdiness, and most of his fellow students knew him as a nervous boy. Unexceptional in most subjects, Ed did love reading, and so he kept himself to himself and lost himself in pulp fiction instead. In truth, he'd quickly learned that he was not allowed to have friends, even if he had wanted them. Whenever he spoke of his classmates to his mother, she reminded him sharply of their sinful existence, reinforcing what Ed had already experienced with their spiteful games. By the time that Ed was a teenager, his father, George, was well and truly downtrodden and given entirely to drink. Unable to object to anything that Augusta wished for, he took out his frustrations on his 2 sons, and there was much to be frustrated about. The farm that Augusta had given up everything for was failing spectacularly, and the Geins were quickly becoming just another farm slipping into destitution. The farmhouse had never had any modernisation since they'd taken it on, and at night it sat in the dim orange glow of kerosene lamps, thanks to it not having any electricity. As the infertile fields around the house lay barren, George's health worsened, eventually leading to his death in 1940 at the age of 66. His death came as little more than a relief for Augusta, who had watched his decline for almost 3 years. For her useless husband was finally out of the way, and for Ed, his abusive father would finally leave him alone. In an effort to make money outside of the farm, Ed worked as a handyman from time to time, taking on odd jobs for the neighbours, doing small DIY things, and even did a bit of babysitting here and there. Strangely, for someone who would never fit in at school, now in his 30s, he seemed to find it quite easy to get on with the kids around town. The parents were all too happy to have his help. He was a little odd, they thought, a little quiet and shy for sure, but he was well-spoken and polite, and he was always happy to help anyone whenever they asked something of him. Ed did try to join the army in 1942, but he'd been rejected on health grounds, thanks to a fleshy growth on his left eyelid that caused it to droop and obscure his vision. Still, between the money that he made doing odd jobs and his brother's work as a construction contractor, the farm scraped by with the little livestock that they did maintain. Sadly, that income was severely hamstrung 2 years later, in the spring of 1944, when Henry died in an accident on the farm. Ed and Henry had been burning marshland on the farm when the fire got out of control, whipped up by the strong winds, and after a short separation, Henry was found lying on the ground, apparently dead from asphyxiation. Ed had alerted the sheriff, and afterwards he'd led the search party straight to his brother's body. There was never any suspicion of foul play, and so an inquest was never held, but sometimes rumours floated about Plainfield. Some people said that Henry had been seen with bruises on his head, and others said that they never saw any signs of burns on his skin or clothes. But the coroner had ruled smoke inhalation as the culprit, and so nothing else was ever said. Besides, Ed had no reason to hurt his brother. The two got on perfectly well. Ed did find Henry's criticism of his mother a little harsh sometimes. He especially didn't like the way that Henry suggested that she was too strict on Ed, but these were no reasons to suspect anyone of murder. Or at least, not in any rational world they weren't. For Ed, following his brother's death, his world continued to shrink ever smaller. He continued doing odd jobs, and in his spare time, he read adventure fiction, full of stories of wild savages and their exotic practices that spurred his imagination. Things were quiet on the farm, with just him and his mother rattling around their large house, but Augusta always managed to keep things running. In fact, Augusta liked to keep things spotless, and she unsurprisingly kept a tight ship. Even in his adult years, she still kept up with Ed's spiritual education, and now, with Ed being much older, she frequently turned her attention to warnings of the diseased harlots from town, reminding him of his godly duties in life, including abstinence. Unfortunately, the health of the Gein family continued to decline, and soon after his brother's death, Augusta was rushed to hospital by Ed following a stroke. Ed stayed by her side, reading her the Bible night after night, until her discharge, where the two returned to the farmhouse, and Ed continued his role as carer for his mother, like the good son that he'd always strived to be. From her bed, Augusta dictated the chores around the farm for Ed, which he carried out diligently. At night, he sat by her bedside and read from the Bible. Augusta's recovery took almost a full year, but eventually she did find her feet once more, though it didn't last more than half a year, until December of 1945, when she once more suffered a stroke. This time, it brought an end to her life, on the 29th of December, just as the new year was creeping over the horizon. Ed, back at the farmhouse alone, sold off the remaining livestock in order to pay for his mother's funeral. Lost and alone, he quickly appeared to lose his way. Most people noticed his lack of personal hygiene. At times, especially when he lay in bed at night, he thought he could hear his mother's voice, and other times he saw faces where he was sure there shouldn't be any. He also frequently felt sick from the stench of flesh that he could smell in the air. He sealed off his mother's room, nailing boards across the door, and began living between two rooms of the large house. The farm itself soon fell to ruin, with Ed making a small amount of money renting some of the land to a neighbour, but they'd never been especially reliable with the payments, which did annoy him. In general, though, Ed retreated from life. He still carried out the odd handyman job here and there, but for the most part he sat at home, eating the same old dinner of tinned pork and beans, and read true crime and pulp fiction magazines. Occasionally, he liked to mix it up with Nazi history, and he found a great deal of interest in some of the more heinous crimes of the Holocaust. If he did go out, it was to roller skate at the local rink, or to have supper with a neighbour after doing them a favour. At times, he stopped into Mary Hogan's tavern over in Bancroft. The tavern owner, Mary Hogan, reminded him of his mother, but she was a rude, loud-mouthed and sinful woman who had rumoured links to organised crime, so he never much liked her. More than anything, he just missed his mother. Some nights he drove out to the cemetery, stood by her burial plot and tried to will her back to life. When it didn't work, he returned home dejected and wondered why he had failed. Then, he sat on his bed and read another magazine and tried to put the voices out of his head.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics. We go back to source materials in their original languages.
And we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
Did you know ancient Romans used to brush their teeth with urine?
Or that there's a medieval recipe for exploding soup?
Or that in the 19th century London, people held seances to talk to ghosts inside their plumbing?
That's the kind of weird crap you might hear on the Box of Oddities podcast.
But now we're hitting the road to do live shows.
Nobody asked us to, but we're doing it anyway.
We're Kat and Jethro.
Join us for an unforgettable evening of strange stories, twisted trivia, and deeply unnecessary research.
The Box of Oddities. It's Alive 2025 Fall Tour.
It's like history gets drunk and tells you its secrets.
We're coming to Seattle,
Portland,
OKC,
Atlanta,
Philadelphia,
Appleton, Wisconsin,
Louisville, Kentucky,
and Chicago, Illinois Halloween night.
Get your tickets at theboxofoddities.com.
Again, that's theboxofoddities.com.
Because if history can repeat itself, so can we.
That's theboxofoddities.com.
All right, that's enough.
Frank Warden's immediate suspicions of Ed Gein might have seemed a little unusual to some. Ed was a little quiet, sure. Perhaps he was a little strange, but for the most part, he was a helpful member of the community, always looking to lend people a hand when they needed it. Frank's suspicions weren't baseless, though. Ed had showed up at the hardware store the previous night and spoken to Frank, asking him directly if he would be out hunting all day today, before inquiring about the price of antifreeze. For a while now, he'd been hanging around outside the store, too, loitering about. He'd even asked his mother if she'd like to go to the roller skating rink with him. Perhaps most damning, though, was the receipt that Frank had found by the counter, made out that morning in his mother's handwriting, for the sale of antifreeze. Meanwhile, out at the Gein farmhouse, Ed was sitting in his car with a couple of his neighbours, Bob and Darlene Hill, whose parents ran a nearby grocery store. The battery for Bob's car had run flat, and he'd popped over to Ed's with his sister to ask for a lift into town. As usual, Ed had been more than happy to help. He just needed to wash up first, as his hands were covered in blood, which he told them was from dressing a deer. Bob thought that was a bit strange. Ed wasn't known as a big deer hunter, but it was the season, after all. The two waited for Ed to clean up, and then all three jumped in his car and headed into town, and afterwards, Ed stopped over at the Hills for dinner. They were relaxing in the lounge with coffee when another neighbour rushed into the Hill house, full of excitement, to tell them all about the commotion in town and the apparent murder that had taken place at the Warden's store. Bob Hill was keen to go and check out the store for himself, and he asked Ed if he'd drive him into town to take a look. Shrugging, Ed agreed. The two were sitting in Ed's car with the engine idling when Sheriff Sly arrived to ask the Hills if they'd seen Ed. Sly had already driven up to the Gein farmhouse and found it empty, so he thought he'd try the Hills, as Ed was known to visit for dinner from time to time. Thankfully, he'd been right on the money. Stepping out of the patrol car, he rapped on Ed's car window and asked him to jump into the police car for a moment in order to ask him a few questions. Ed obliged and casually strolled over to the car, sliding into the back, where he told the sheriff what he'd been doing all day. Sheriff Sly wasn't convinced, and when he asked Ed to repeat his story, he noticed more than a few contradictions. Getting flustered, Ed began to stutter and panic, telling the sheriff that he'd been framed. The sheriff then asked him what he'd been framed for, and Ed said the murder of Bernice Warden. Nobody had said anything about Miss Warden being dead, though, and so without hesitation, Sheriff Sly arrested Ed on suspicion of robbery, radioing his news into the station at Wautoma, where he took Ed to stash him in a county jailhouse. With Ed locked up in the county jailhouse, Sheriff Sly drove back out to the Gein farmhouse, with Captain Chef Oyster in tow, the two hoping to find some clue as to Bernice Warden's whereabouts. It was almost 8 p.m. when they arrived, pulling up outside the dark farmhouse. The kids in town had long since joked that the Gein farmhouse was haunted, and now Sheriff Sly felt that he could see why. Stepping out of the car, the two men made their way round the house, checking the windows, all covered with makeshift grubby curtains, and every door, though they were all locked. When they reached the rear of the house, they found the back door leading to the kitchen that was only fixed with a flimsy latch. And so, backing up, Sly kicked the door from its frame and then, torch in hand, stepped inside. Captain Cheffoyster made a beeline towards the door, leading further into the interior of the house, while Sly stepped backwards, bumping into something heavy behind him. Turning around and flashing his torch up towards the rafters, he took in the sight of what he felt sure was a deer hanging from a butcher's hook, before his eyes corrected him and then widened with the reality of the gruesome sight. Hanging by the ankles from a 3-foot-wide branch that had been winched up to the ceiling, there was the body of a naked woman, sagged and laying upside down. The head was missing, and a large gaping wound bisected the torso, the insides glistening clean. Disgusted at the sight, Sly stumbled outside, fell to his knees and threw up into the snow, before steeling himself enough to walk over to his car and radio into the station that he had found Mrs. Warden. As unhappy as the thought made him, Sly knew that he had to go back inside. So hesitantly, he once more lifted his torch and stepped into the rear kitchen. Taking a closer look at the body, he could see that the branch had been holding the body off the ground had been forced through the tendons and Achilles' heels at the ankles, tearing right through the right leg, which had been strapped on by a piece of rope. The same rope had been used to tie the arms to the woman's sides. Turning his eyes away from the body, Sly joined Chef Oyster, who was holding a kerosene lamp, and the two men ventured further into the house. The dim lights bounced around the room, spotlighting piles upon piles of junk. Everyone knew that Ed had been reclusive, but nobody quite expected that he'd been living in such squalor. Strewn about across the place were old food boxes, empty tins, an old stove sat in one corner with piles of paperwork, empty bowls and half-full paint tins stacked up on top. There was a violin sitting on top of an old dresser whose drawers had fallen out, dropping their contents across the floor. A coffee tin rested next to the sink, full of old used chewing gum. The whole place was a hoarder's nightmare, more closely resembling a garbage tip than a home. The two officers could scarcely believe that anyone could live in such a state. Everywhere they looked, they found junk, rotting food and empty boxes. Worse, the stench that filled the air smelt like something had crawled in and died in a corner somewhere. Unfortunately, the reality of that soon became apparent, and the truth was much, much worse. Everywhere they looked, new horrors were found. They found bowls made from what looked suspiciously like human skulls resting on their uneven bottoms, half full with crusted food. More human skulls were found attached to Ed's bedposts. Apparently, he'd taken to sleeping in the room next to the kitchen. On the table, there was a homemade hunting knife, sheathed in human skin, and the chairs of the tables themselves seemed to have also been reupholstered with the same fleshy covering. Everywhere they looked, things were fashioned from flesh. As they picked through the piles of boxes, each one turned up something newly grotesque. Flipping open the lid of one box, they found 4 human noses, dried and discarded, whilst another box found the remains of 8 desiccated vulvas, one that was more fresher than the rest, which had been wrapped round with a red ribbon. A Quaker Oats box resting by the stove was filled with fatty flesh, and in a bag next to it, a human heart was found, fresh and still wet from blood. The more Sly looked, the worse it seemed to become. Discarded next to an upturned mattress, he found a pair of leggings made from the skin seemingly stripped and removed from a pair of human legs. Alongside these was what could only be described as a corset fashioned from the skin of a human female torso, breasts and all. A lace had been threaded through the rear as if it could be worn and tightened to fit. Alongside all of this, Sly also found the skinned faces of 9 women removed from their skulls, hair and scalp and all, and then stuffed with paper where they seemed to have dried out. Some looked like they'd been oiled to keep them supple. Pulling apart 2 mattresses, Sly grasped at a bloody bag and inside found the head of Bernice Warden. 2 nails had been implanted into her ears and linked with twine in order for it to be hung like a picture from a wall. The whole thing was a scene of deepest nightmares. It seemed everywhere he looked, human remains had been chopped up, discarded or stored in some filthy, grotesque collection. Meanwhile, Chef Oyster was busy removing boards from a doorway that led further into the house, When they fell away, he uncovered, quite contrary to the rest of the house, a perfectly clean room, spotless if not for the layers of dust that had settled upon everything. Inside was the bedroom of Mrs. Gein, perfectly preserved like a time capsule, the juxtaposition next to the rest of the house enough to give an onlooker whiplash. As he marvelled at this clean room, Sly called out to him. Holding in his hands, he'd pulled up an old bag and found the skinned face of a woman which he recognised immediately as that of the disappeared tavern owner, Mary Hogan. It was 5 a.m. by the time the sheriff and the captain finally left the farmhouse, the crime lab having been called in to collect up as much of the twisted contents as possible. Sheriff Sly had not had the position very long, and yet here he was, having dealt with the kind of crime that nobody could have possibly dreamt up in their worst nightmares. In some state of shock, he made his way to the county jailhouse, where he would find Ed, and somehow find a way to begin to question him. The next morning, the local papers had done their best to extract as much of the story as they could from the rumours that had been floating around throughout town following the discovery of the farmhouse. Sheriff Sly had requested a complete press blackout, but naturally, when an operation involved so many officers, drips always managed to leak out here and there. For the most part, though, the earliest stories in the papers seemed clueless as to the reality of the situation. Missing widow found, slain near Plainfield. A widow, missing from her store since early in the day, was found slain Saturday night in a field on a nearby farm. An unidentified man was taken into custody. Sheriff Art Sly refused to say how Mrs. Warden died or describe the nature of her wounds. The piece was all very sanitised in comparison to some of the rumours that were circling around Plainfield that several skeletons had been found. Meanwhile, the post-mortem was being carried out on Mrs. Warden's body by Dr. Eigenberger, who dictated the findings to his wife. In conclusion, his examination found that Mrs. Warden had not been sexually assaulted, though her entire vagina had been removed, along with all of her internal organs, the whole cavity inside the body having been thoroughly washed out. A bullet was found lodged behind the right eye, along with a bullet wound entering from the rear of a decapitated head, which the doctor was quite sure had been the cause of death, with all mutations having been carried out afterwards. At the same time, Sly had arranged for a thorough search of all 195 acres of the Gein farm, which, thanks to the recent snowfall, sat under 4 inches of fresh snow. Not quite sure what it was they were looking for, they were equally afraid of what they might find, especially after news began to creep out of Ed's crimes, and every missing person and murder that had ever taken place in the entire state was being linked to it some way or another. At the same time, Ed was back in the jailhouse, denying everything. As far as he was concerned, he'd only ever killed Bernice Warden, despite the existence of Mary Hogan's head suggesting otherwise. The problem with Ed's painfully difficult to extract confession was that he didn't seem to realise quite what he'd done in the first place. The details seemed to suggest that Ed had shot Mrs. Warden in the back of the head with a rifle from the store, but to Ed, the whole thing had happened to him whilst he was in some kind of amnesic daze. When I went into Mrs. Warden's, I took a glass jug for permanent antifreeze. When I entered the hardware store, she came toward me and said, "Do you want a gallon of antifreeze?" And I said, "No, a half gallon." She got out the antifreeze and pumped it out, and I held the jug for her to pour it in, and then she pumped out another quart, and I was still holding the jar while she pumped that. Then I paid her with a $1 bill. She gave me back 1 cent because it was 99 cents. This is what I can't remember from now on, because I don't know just what happened from now on, you see. She glanced out the window toward the filling station across the street and said, "They are checking the deer there." Then she looked towards the west, out of the west and north windows, and said, "There are more people uptown than I thought there would be." She might have said something about the opening of the season. She might have said that. That is what I can't remember. It's hard for me to say from now on. My memory is a little vague, but I do remember dragging her across the floor. I remember loading her body in the truck. Then I drove the truck out to the East Road at the intersection where 51 and 73 separate east of Plainfield. I drove the truck up in the pine trees. Then I walked to town and got in my car and drove it out there and loaded her body in the back of the car, and also the cash register. I loaded the cash register in the truck when I put her body in there. Then I drove out to my farm and took the body out of the car and hung it up by the heels in my woodshed. When asked what happened from that point on, he said only, This is as close as I can remember. I was in a regular daze and I can't swear to it. As hazy as he was on the details, Ed was, at least, seemingly being quite helpful to the police officers questioning him. In fact, if anything, he was almost too helpful given the situation. Overall, he seemed fairly eager to please, and most people questioned whether he was aware of just how serious his situation really was. Ed just kept insisting that he'd never killed more than one person. When the officers asked where he'd managed to get the rest of the human body parts that had littered his house, he told them that he'd been visiting a few of the local graveyards for the past 10 years, digging the graves of recently deceased women that he'd read about in the obituaries of the local paper. Most of the time he took the bodies home, he said. Sometimes he took the parts he wanted and then drove the mutilated corpses back out into the graveyard to put them back, with his initial excitement having departed and leaving him a deep feeling of remorse at his actions. He'd done all this, he said, purely out of scientific interest. He said that as a kid he'd always wanted to be a doctor, and now he was just hoping to satisfy his own intellectual curiosity. Rest assured, he never had sex with any of the bodies, he insisted to the officers. The bodies had simply smelled too bad. Unfortunately, as with his confession to killing Bernice Warden, almost all of Ed's crimes were carried out under a similar haze, and so details were once more thin on the ground. Overall, opinion seemed to be fairly evenly split over whether or not he was telling the truth, with some considering Ed a cold, calculating criminal who had killed many more people than he was letting on and was now trying to cover his tracks, whilst others thought him honest, his grave digging the signs of someone deeply troubled. In an effort to solve the suspicion, he was transported to the state capital of Madison, where he was to be questioned by Joe Wilimowski, a polygraph specialist. Throughout the questioning, Ed went deeper into detail, explaining how he dug the graves, of how he would work the corpses' heads back and forth in his hands in order to snap the bones in the neck, and of how he salted his collection of vaginas in order to preserve them, whilst he oiled his masks to keep them soft. He told the police of how he dressed up in a skin suit, slipping on the leggings and tying up his corset and wearing a mask in order to roleplay as his dead mother. Most of the time he stayed indoors whilst he did this, but at times, when the nights were warm, he went outside to strut about under the moonlight. When asked if he did this a lot, he shrugged and said no, not that often, as he had other things to do. Throughout the questioning, he happily snacked away on a serving of apple pie and cheese, though he did complain at one point that the cheese was a little bit dry. Whilst Ed was explaining his grave-robbing activities, he was still hesitant to admit to any murders, though he did eventually agree that he must have killed both Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. The details were just hazy. As for all the other murders the press and police were investigating and trying to pin on him, he denied them all outright. The police would have to get to the bottom of the whole thing eventually, and it was becoming more and more apparent that the most likely route to do so would be to exhume the bodies from the cemeteries that Ed had admitted to defiling, though for now the officials hoped to avoid that direction if possible. Meanwhile, back in the crime lab, the ballistics experts had linked the bullet removed from Bernice Warden's skull with one found in a rifle left in the hardware store, tying the weapon to the murder. Unfortunately, for Sheriff Sly and all the police involved with the investigation, by Thursday, the press were well and truly done with being kept in the dark, and yet another story broke about the case, this time containing leaks from Gein's recent questioning where he detailed dressing in his skin suit. The piece was headlined, "Obsessive love for his mother drove Gein to slay. Rob Graves' ghoulish acts were stirred by her death. He thought victims resembled parents. Authorities learned during quizzing." Ed, the piece detailed, had been hit hard by his mother's death, until, eventually, he decided that he would attempt to raise her from the dead through sheer willpower alone. When that obviously failed, he instead took to murdering and digging graves in an effort to create her anew. Ed, they said, who had always been warned away from women by his mother, had eventually grown to want to become one, even considering operating on himself. Unsurprisingly, this story exploded through the public sphere as more and more of Gein's confessions began to filter out. Everyone suddenly became armchair psychoanalysts as they leapt to diagnose him with Oedipus complexes and keen to pin his heinous crimes on his feminine attitudes or his displays of psychosis. Rumours of necrophilia, schizophrenia and psychopathy abound as people looked to anything to try and make sense of a case that was nothing but deeply unsettling. The police did their best to end the torrent of speculation by releasing a statement that any diagnosis would be a job for trained psychiatrists. If anyone was happy about that leak, it was Ed's attorney, who had been banking on pleading not guilty on the grounds of insanity. As it happened, this appeared to be the next step for the police anyway. In order to stand trial in the first place, Ed would have to prove that he was fit to defend himself and assist his attorney in his defence. This was a criteria that many felt quite sure he would fail. In order to find out the truth, he was submitted to the doctors at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a huge institution housing 300 inmates in maximum security settings, though they did have a baseball diamond and a working farm. During his stay there, Ed was to undergo 30 days of intense examinations, where he was prodded, probed, questioned and tested. In the meantime, police were gearing up to face the real possibility that to settle things, they were going to have to exhume the graves of Ed's mutilated victims. Aware that this was a deeply sensitive issue with the locals, especially as many thought Ed nothing but a liar, they had done everything they could do to try and avoid such a scenario, including having the crime lab test the soil discovered on some of the body parts taken from Ed's farm with that of the cemeteries. But with such a huge amount of evidence to claw through, they just hadn't had the time to do it. In the end, the police concluded that by digging up one or two of the graves that Ed had named, they would be able to tell if he was telling the truth or not. If his stories tallied with what they had discovered, they would assume that the other half-dozen graves would all tell the same story and leave them be. This whole operation was planned for Tuesday, and then, in an effort to slip the press, they carried it out on Monday. The cemetery was circled with police, hoping to stop anyone approaching, and a tent was erected over the first grave, that of 52-year-old Eleanor Adams, who had died 6 years earlier. It was not a coincidence that this body had been buried right next to the Gein family vault. Despite the police's best efforts to keep the operation quiet, news that something was afoot soon spread round the town, and in a flash, the press descended on the graveyard, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever the police were to uncover. In one particularly audacious move, the Milwaukee Journal hired a plane to fly over the vicinity in a desperate attempt at snatching the scoop. Under the cover of the tent, officers dug into the cold, hard ground, down and down until they hit the solid coffin beneath. Dragging it up from the grave, it quickly became clear that the lid had been tampered with since its original burial, and in fact it had been split lengthways entirely in two. Whatever it was people were expecting to find, it was probably not what was actually there. When they flipped the pieces of the lid from the base of the coffin, they found the whole thing completely empty, all except from a single metal crowbar, lying in the centre of the coffin. With Ed's story beginning to look like it had been true all along, they next turned their attention to the grave of Mabel Everson, a 69-year-old woman who had died in 1951. Once again, they dug down into the dirt. This time, they didn't have to go far, though. The remains of Mabel were uncovered just feet below the surface. Apparently, this was one of Ed's mutilation victims that he decided to return to its grave, only he'd done a pretty poor job. Aside from having been dumped into a shallow grave, she had had her skull removed along with several limbs. The police decided that they'd seen enough. This was all now clear that Ed had been telling the truth. They wrapped up the operation and headed home. Unfortunately, the exhumations had not had the effect on the investigation that some had wished for. Over the course of the last few days, two camps had formed within the officials involved. There were those that wanted the case investigated from top to bottom with all the facts laid bare, and those who just wanted the whole thing finished as quickly as possible, and who knew that they could already tie it to two murders quite comfortably. In the end, the side of an extensive investigation won out, with the state governor, Vernon Thompson, stepping in to reshuffle the leadership and demand that the police operate under the assumption that Ed had committed more than two murders. To that end, Ed was submitted to 2 further polygraph sessions, totaling well over 7 hours, though nothing really new came from it. When more skeletons were found on the Gein farm in a garbage trench a quarter mile from the farmhouse, the public waited on bated breath for the police to uncover more murders, but nothing ever materialised. Eventually, Ed's psychological report was handed into the judges on the 18th of December 1957, detailing everything from test results to Ed's biographical sketches. In conclusion, the extensive document that totalled more than 21 pages wrote that Ed was quite comfortably insane. For a prolonged period, he had suffered from frequent bouts of headaches and nausea, often brought on through the olfactory hallucinations of rotting flesh. The results of the Rorschach test that he had undertaken showed him to be intelligent but immature and with insufficient ego. He had a very strong feminine identification, it said, and truly bizarre religious beliefs, including the thoughts that he was carrying out God's justice on impure women when he had killed Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. The first, who he believed to have been involved in what he called crooked business, whilst the second, Ed claimed, wooed her husband away from another woman. When it came to sexuality, Ed had intense feelings of guilt, and in general, he tended to project much of the blame for his crimes onto an abstract external evil that had compelled him to carry them out. He seemed a bitter, angry man who had blamed much of the situation on his neighbours, who he said had taken advantage of him over the years. When he had dug the bodies from the graves, he frequently felt the need to care for them and treated them like dolls. His mother was the only positive character in his life, who he revered above all and called good in every way. When it came to his intelligence and cognitive abilities, Ed's IQ tests were shown to be on the lower end of average, but the doctors believed his score had been affected by his emotional imbalance, as they found him perfectly intelligent in conversation, and actually they described him as quite bright overall. In the end, the doctors wrote that Ed was a very suggestible person who appears emotionally dull. Beneath that lies aggressiveness that may be expressed by inappropriate reactions that are followed by remorse and mild-manneredness. He is an immature person who withdraws and finds forming relationships with others difficult. He has rather rigid moral concepts which he expects others to follow. He is suspicious of others and tends to project blame for his own inadequacies onto them. His fantasy life is immature in nature. Possibly he pictures himself as much more adequate and bigger man than he is. Sexually, he is a conflicted individual and is functioning on an immature level. Guilt feelings are great and repression is put to use quite frequently in this area. In general, it appears that this is basically a schizophrenic personality with several neurotic manifestations. At the present time, he is confused and has difficulty in looking at his situation realistically. Placed before 6 specialists, the conclusion was that Ed was utterly incapable of standing trial and had an inability to determine right from wrong due to being enveloped in a world of fantasy. Unable to stand trial, he was therefore legally insane. With no trial to be had, Ed was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane indefinitely. The following Monday, on the 6th of January, Ed was manacled and carted out to the official hearing, where 3 psychologists, Drs. Schubert, Miller and Burns, testified that Ed's condition made him legally insane and unfit to stand trial. Dr. Burns didn't quite see eye to eye with the first 2 doctors, saying that whilst he believed Ed to have been medically quite insane, he did think him capable of conferring with his attorney, and therefore, in a strange legal twist, this actually made him legally sane. When it fell to the judge, he made no bones to declare Ed insane and unfit to stand trial, officially sentencing him to stay in a hospital until such time as he might be fit to stand trial, a feat which none could quite imagine. As expected, this result did not go down especially well with the locals of Plainfield, who knew Ed as nothing but a quiet, shy, helpful young man, polite and intelligent, and certainly not a lunatic. Surely, they argued, he had fooled the experts to avoid punishment for his crimes. For several months, meetings were held by the locals, who were angling to appeal the judge's decision, but nothing ever materialised. The counter-argument to all the local anger came from the hospital psychologists, who said simply that the very fact that Ed had managed to maintain a veneer of sanity amongst the community, despite carrying out the crimes that he had, was proof enough that he was clearly insane. This was a sentiment that was difficult to disagree with. 3 months after his confinement, the Gein farm was scheduled to be auctioned off, much to the chagrin of the locals who feared it being turned into a macabre tourist attraction. 3 days before the viewing was set to begin, a mysterious fire ripped through the wooden structure, burning it to the ground. The police and fire service got involved, carrying out an investigation, but it was never seen as suspicious. When Ed was informed of the blaze, he simply shrugged and said, "Just as well." In the hospital, Ed had made his new home in a small cell decorated only with a bed, table and bedside cabinet. With little hope of release, he had only a long, quiet life of menial work, mopping floors and doing the laundry to look forward to, for which he was paid 50 cents a week. Unsurprisingly, the solitude suited Ed quite well, and he settled down quickly, becoming the model patient. He kept himself to himself, fostered an interest in ham radio, and dutifully attended his 6-month review to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he failed each and every time. At least, that was until 1968, 10 years after his initial committal, when doctors rated him legally sane and fit to stand trial. This came as quite a shock to everyone involved, especially Ed, who was still clinically quite insane. Still, with the legal definition as it was, Ed was trotted out to stand trial, an affair that lasted a week and had very little drama, aside from that raised by the Plainfield locals, who, after fighting for a trial previously, now wanted nothing more than for the whole thing to just go away and stay buried. In conclusion, Ed was found guilty of murder, but in yet another strange legal twist, he was found to have been insane, and therefore not guilty on a technicality. He was guilty, but not guilty. Sane, but completely insane. It was a strange legal world, and the judge saw no issue with sending him back to the state hospital until the end of his days. 6 years later, Ed did petition this ruling, applying for release. During this hearing, a psychologist carried out a series of tests, including one where he read out several proverbs and asked Ed what he thought they meant. When asked what the meaning of "a bird in the hand is worth one in the bush" meant, Ed answered, "If you have a bird in your hand, you might squeeze him too much and kill him." Unsurprisingly, his petition was denied. Quite aside from being insane, the judge also felt concerned that Ed had by now been institutionalized and would be a danger to himself in the open world. In truth, Ed was an aging man and had been showing signs of mental deterioration. In 1978, he was transferred to the Mendoza Mental Health Institute in Madison, a lower security hospital where he lived for a further 8 years, before his death at the age of 72 from respiratory failure on the 26th of July, 1986. Finally dead, those locals of Plainfield affected by his crimes were able to breathe a sigh of relief. Edward Theodore Gein had cast a tall shadow over the area for many years. Not least of those affected were the police officers like Sheriff Sly, who responded to the investigation and discovered horrors that most could not even imagine. The life of Edward Gein, however, would never seem to vanish completely. His crimes so gruesome in nature and his story so bizarre, it was always destined to be retold. In fact, far from disappearing into obscurity like most would have wished, Gein found global notoriety that transgressed generations, thanks in no small part to the books and films that followed. Robert Bloch's book, Psycho, published in 1959, just a year after the whole affair, modelled the central character of Norman Bates on the troubled murderer. And this story then reached an even wider audience when it was adapted to cinema with the Hitchcock classic. In 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre owed more than a nod towards Gein, as did Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, released in 1991 and adapted from the 1988 Thomas Harris novel of the same name. It's far from surprising that so much horror would find inspiration in Ed Gein's crimes. They were, after all, deeply frightening, complex, tragic and grotesque. His was a story unique in its depravities, and as such, it still intrigues today, as we continue to try and comprehend just what it is that causes a human to carry out some of the most hideous crimes imaginable. So that was the story of Ed Gein, and I guess there's a bit to talk about after these short advert breaks.
Hello, listeners. This is Ann Bogle, author, blogger, and creator of the podcast, What Should I Read Next? Since 2016, I've been helping readers bring more joy and delight into their reading lives. Every week, I tackle all things books and reading with a guest and guide them in discovering their next read. They share 3 books they love, 1 book they don't, and what they've been reading lately. And I recommend 3 titles they may enjoy reading next. Guests have said our conversations are like therapy, troubleshooting issues that have plagued their reading lives for years, and possibly the rest of their lives as well. And of course, recommending books that meet the moment, whether they are looking for deep introspection to spur or encourage a life change, or a frothy page-turner to help them escape the stresses of work, school, everything. You'll learn something about yourself as a reader, and you'll definitely walk away confident to choose your next read with a whole list of new books and authors to try. So join us each Tuesday for What Should I Read Next? Subscribe now wherever you're listening to this podcast and visit our website, whatshouldireadnextpodcast.com, to find out more.
Welcome back. Yeah, so the story of Ed Gein. This is a funny one because obviously this is a huge story that's reasonably well known. I would say it's probably very well known. It's probably been done by quite a few podcasts. So I kind of put it off for that reason. But I also sort of put it off because, to be honest, I find this one quite disturbing. I don't know I do know what it is about it. But obviously I've done other stories of Dark Histories that are quite bad as well, quite dark, quite gross, and they've never really sort of affected me in a way that this one has. I find this story just generally difficult, and I think it's because I have a lot of quite complex feelings about it, like I'm sure you do, and like that's what makes the story so intriguing, I suppose. Is in many respects, I just have an overwhelming sense of I feel sorry for him because he had absolutely no chance in life, but at the same time, his crimes were just so grotesque, and his interests were just so. What he'd done was just so unspeakable in many respects that you cannot sympathise with this guy, right? It's so difficult to sympathise with him, but at the same time, like I say, I just felt quite sorry for him in a lot of respects. He was clearly an incredibly troubled chap, and when you read his sort of biography, you see that it's like I say, he just had no chance. His mother. Well, his parents, were equally failed him on so many counts. It was clearly unspeakably difficult. That said, his brother turned out considerably better. So, everyone has choices, and that's why I say it's difficult to sympathise with him in 100% because, his brother had much of the same problems as he had, and yet his brother was quite fine until he mysteriously died, which I guess takes us, a nice segue into that. Clearly, Ed killed him. I think it's never actually, it's up in the air whether he killed him or not. Some people say that the bruises on his head that were found were from him falling over, and that he did die of asphyxiation from the smoke. But, it's suggested very strongly that he perhaps did kill him. And this leads to one of the biggest problems with this case is that actually there is so much of the primary resources available for this case, which is great, but they're actually not very useful. So the confession, the transcription of his questioning, I've got a book that actually has just start to finish his entire transcript of all the times he was questioned, hours of questioning. But it's not that useful because a lot of it is Ed just being quite quite quiet and just saying answering yes or no to things, and a lot of it is what I felt would probably today be called leading questions from the police. They're like, oh, so you went and did this, and then Ed just says yes, or no. He does clarify in a few cases, and he does go into detail in some cases. But for a lot of it, it's just not that useful because, and like I say, he said that everything was a haze for him. So he could never really give detail because he never had it, because for him, it was all a haze. Now, whether or not that was truly him coming over with a kind of episode, like a psychotic episode or a schizophrenic episode, or whether that was him sort of finding some way to protect himself and just it's some sort of level of denial, I don't know. Like I say, you could have a field day if you wanted to sort of psychoanalyze this case, I guess. And obviously hundreds of people have tried, and that's a big part of it. I don't really want to comment too much on his specific diagnosis or whatever, but clearly it's clearly obvious he was very mentally unwell. Whether that was brought on by his situation or exacerbated by his situation, is anyone's guess. You can only assume that it's true. As for the other murders, I do think it's also, I think he probably was telling the truth about only killing 2 people. I think he did only kill 2 people because, obviously the police investigated so many other murders that were from the local area that could be pinned on him. But I just don't think they make sense. Like, one of them was a young girl, and Ed's sort of MO was women that reminded him of his mother, basically. And a young girl babysitting isn't that. And another one was like two hunters. Well, that's not that. Again, I don't think he was necessarily like a murderer in the sense that he would just kill anyone that he had the opportunity to kill. I think he had a very specific MO, because clearly a lot of his problems rose from his mother's death. And that, I guess, is one of the most fascinating elements of the case. His dressing up in a skin costume, which is, I think, one of the more difficult elements of the case that I find. That side of things is quite an interesting sort of from a psychological perspective, like what he was going through there. But like I say, overall, a fascinating story, one that I feel probably I should have done at some point with Dark Histories. Part of me is always like, should I do this because it's a big story, and I don't know if I really need to retread those paths, or but part of me thinks that I should tackle these kind of bigger stories. And so, but I've done it now, so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my take on it, at least. It was an interesting story to read into. So I knew obviously of Ed Gein, but I'd never read his transcripts and things like that. And that was definitely interesting to read, if not a little bit troubling. But it was interesting to read. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to contact me, you can do so. My email address is contact@darkhistories.com. There's also social media. All of that's in the show notes and on the website, which is darkhistories.com, where you'll also find links to all the ways that you can support the show if you would like to. Otherwise, I'll be back next week with another episode of Yesterday Today, and then 2 weeks for another full episode. And that's assuming that this is all going to be fine and my RSS feed is going to distribute perfectly, which I'm say it should do. If you listen to this, it has. So yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you very much for listening. I will speak to you very soon. So until then, take care. Sleep tight.